Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching the Africa Brief on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top stories coming out of the region this hour. Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan secures over 95% of the vote in a landslide election victory. This has come from the state TV amid ongoing internet blackout. The result comes after days of deadly protests, with the opposition claiming hundreds killed and the UN reporting credible evidence of at least 10 deaths. President Donald Trump designates Nigeria as a country of particular concern over religious freedom violations, opening the door to possible sanctions. Trump claims Christians face an existential threat, while Nigeria denies the allegations, saying most attacks by armed groups target Muslims in the north. More than 60,000 people have fled Al-Fashur in Darfur after its capture by the Rapid Support Forces militia, the UN has said. The mass exodus comes amid reports of executions, abductions and ethnic targeting as fighting intensifies in Sudan's west. Witnesses say hundreds of men were shot or disappeared after Al-Fashur fell, and the rise of the RSF paramilitary, with civilians describing summary executions. Aid groups warn of possible war crimes and urge an independent international investigation into the killings. A Tunisian court sentences a prominent critic of President Kais Saied to 5 years in prison as authorities suspend an independent media network. Rights groups say the actions mark a deepening crackdown on dissent and press freedom in the country. Cameroon's opposition leader calls for a nationwide ghost town protest that is already being observed in the northern city of Mora. Businesses and markets remain closed as fears of a harsh government response grow amid political tensions. Israeli media reports that body parts handed over by the Red Cross do not belong to any of the missing hostages after forensic examinations were completed. The transfer had followed Israel's return of 30 Palestinian bodies to Gaza, a move seen as part of efforts to sustain the fragile ceasefire despite recent deadly strikes. Chinese President Xi Jinping is meeting South Korean President Lee Jae-myung on the final day of the APEC summit, his first visit to South Korea in over a decade. Tanzania's Electoral Commission has declared President Samia Suluhu Hassan the winner of Wednesday's general election with nearly 98% of the vote, a result that has triggered deadly protests across the country. The poll, which has taken place amid the exclusion of major opposition candidates, has been widely criticised as unfair. The main opposition party, Chadema, claims around 700 people have been killed in 3 days of unrest, while the United Nations reports at least 10 deaths in Dar es Salaam, Srinagar and Morogoro. Security forces have been accused of using live ammunition and tear gas against demonstrators, while authorities have imposed a nationwide curfew and restricted internet access. The government has dismissed the higher casualty figures as exaggerated, saying violence was limited to isolated incidents. And the United Nations has called for an impartial investigation into allegations of excessive force. Hassan, who first took power in 2021 after the death of John Magufuli, will now serve a 5-year term over the East African nation of 68 million people. Okay, we're now joined by Professor Kilboga Mamfonye. He is an African politics and elections expert, and he joins us live from Pretoria in South Africa. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme, Professor. Now, Professor, President Hassan's landslide comes with reports of violent crackdowns and more than 700 deaths from, of course, the opposition party within Tanzania. The United Nations say there's credible evidence of 10 deaths. How credible is the victory of Hassan's win, given the scale of unrest and alleged intimidation?
Well, given the scale of the unrest and the intimidation, or one should say the pre-election tensions in the country in the run-up to last Wednesday's poll, as well as the outcome now, the credibility of the outcome will obviously be shrouded in uncertainty, in a sense that you don't want to have an election that is marred by violence. And not just violence, but deaths. You know, once we hear that there's a death, or one death is one death too many for an election. And in Africa, we've seen this script over and over and over again, whereby governments, possibly, intending to stay in power for as long as possible. I'm not saying this is the case right now with Tanzania, because we still have to look at, what are the causes of the violence. But in other countries, for instance, we have seen the script in Mozambique. We have seen the script in countries such as Nigeria, Cameroon right now, as your reports were indicating, they are running protests there, election-related protests. So in this case, the credibility of the election will definitely be under question, partly because of the allegations of excessive force, as your reporters are stating, and also the United Nations is also saying there should be investigation. And such excessive force, we have also seen it in previous elections in countries like Zimbabwe. At the end of the day, it will be difficult for the African continent not to obviously accept the President Suluhu's victory as a victory, given that I take it that the Independent National Electoral Commission has got the data which can be verifiable, to show that he has indeed won, according to their reports, and of course, ending in declaring her the winner. But of course, if you have an election that is happening while major opposition party candidates are either arrested or detained or beaten up, others are running away, they are helter-skelter, and they are reported deaths of people, being intimidated. At the end of the day, such an election, the credibility of such an election becomes questionable, as I keep saying.
And Professor Muffonye, what do you have to say about just the sheer landslide that she obtained, supposedly 98% of the vote? Tanzania was once seen as one of Africa's more stable democracies. Does this mark a slide for Tanzania back into authoritarianism?
Over 90, the report says she won a landslide of over 97.7%, if I've got the figure correct. But for me, yes, indeed, if you win an election by that margin, it is indeed supposed to be called a landslide. However, if you win an election with those kinds of figures and allegations of intimidation of opposition figures, including members of the main opposition Chadema party and the others, a crackdown on the media. I understand the internet at one point was shut down. I wasn't observing elections in 2016 in Uganda, where I experienced this kind of situation, whereby just when reports were coming out that apparently the Museveni, party, the NRM, was going to lose, or about to lose, then the internet was shut down. The following day, when the internet was back again, then of course he was announced the winner. Now, in such situations, I don't know whether in the case of Tanzania, this will indicate that the country is now veering into that direction. But clearly, it does not augur well for electoral democracy in the continent. It also does not augur well for free and fair elections. I would be very, very carefully going through the election observer reports, some of which are already very critical about the freeness as well as the fairness of the poll. And in such a situation, obviously, this will affect the legitimacy of the election outcome.
Yes, Professor Muffonye, do stay with us as you're discussing further stories from the region here on NewsX World.